In June 1838, a Cherokee mother clutched her child on a rickety flatboat, the Tennessee River lapping at the edges, so overloaded it nearly sank. "We'll make it," she whispered, her voice trembling, as soldiers barked orders. Behind her, 16,000 of her people faced the same fate, forced from their homes, marching toward a land they didn't know. Over 4,000 would die before they got there, their bodies left along a trail we now call the Trail of Tears. This wasn't just a migration, it was survival, against a tide of guns, greed, and broken promises. Who were these Cherokee, tough enough to endure this nightmare? And how did a people so rooted in America's soil end up fighting to prove they belonged? The Cherokee are indigenous people of North America, tied to the Iroquoian lineage, a family of tribes spread across the continent. They're not newcomers. Their roots dig deep into this land, long before maps carved it up. So where does their name come from? It's a question with no single answer. Some think it might stem from the Choctaw, a nearby tribe whose name could have shifted into Cherokee over time. Others look north to the Iroquois Five Nation tribes, hinting at a shared past or linguistic thread. Then there's the Creek idea, a term from their language meaning people of different speech, which makes sense, since the Cherokee stood out with their unique sound. They called themselves Anianwe, though. That's principal people, a name that carries weight, like an elder saying it, firm and proud, handing it down through the years. Their language is Iroquoian, crisp and alive, the voice of their stories and traditions. But here's the game changer. In 1821, a Cherokee named Sequoyah stepped up. Not a chief or a warrior in the classic mold, but a leader with grit and a big idea. For 12 years, he worked on a syllabary, 86 symbols, each one pegged to a syllable, in their tongue. Picture him carving those first signs into wood or bark, tweaking them, teaching them to anyone who'd listen. By 1821, he'd given the Cherokee a way to write their language down. A people who'd always passed everything by word of mouth could now put it on paper. Letters zipping between towns, knowledge spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just writing, it was a lifeline, a shield for their culture as the outside world started closing in. So where did the Cherokee come from? That's a story with two big ideas, fighting for the spotlight. One theory says they were latecomers to southern Appalachia, the mountains and valleys we now call home, to places like Tennessee and North Carolina. Picture them packing up from the Great Lakes, a sprawling region up north where the Iroquois and other Iroquoian-speaking tribes held sway. This move would have happened way back, in late prehistoric times, long before anyone was writing it down. The other theory flips the map around. It suggests they started way down south, maybe in what's now Texas or northern Mexico, then trekked north to the Great Lakes before doubling back to settle in the Appalachian chain. It's like they took the scenic route through ancient America, their footsteps lost to time. The Cherokee themselves had something to say about it, though. In the late 19th century, around the 1880s and 1890s, an ethnographer named James Mooney sat down with their elders. He listened as they shared an oral tradition, stories passed down, like heirlooms about moving south from the Great Lakes in ancient days. You can imagine those elders, voices steady, recounting a journey that shaped who they'd become. It's not hard proof, but it's a thread that ties their past to the land they'd fight to keep. Zoom out to the timeline, and things get clearer. By 1500 BC, over 3,500 years ago, their language was already its own thing, distinct from the neighbors, a marker of who they were. Fast forward to AD 1000, and the Cherokee were living a woodland life, deep in the forests of the southeast. They weren't just surviving, they were shaping the world around them, influenced by the Mississippian culture. Think big earthen mounds like the ones you can still see traces of today, built for ceremonies or burials. That's the Cherokee staking their claim, blending their ways with the rhythms of the land. Now picture daily life for the Cherokee before the world turned upside down. Their economy was a mix of hard work and know-how rooted in the land they'd lived on for centuries. Agriculture was the backbone. They grew corn, beans, and squash, the trio that kept them fed, year-round, planted together in fields that stretched along riverbanks. Sunflowers towered over the rows, their seeds a snack and oil source, while tobacco sprouted up too, smoked in pipes or traded with neighbors. You can almost see a farmer wiping sweat off his brow, hands stained with soil, coaxing life from the earth. Hunting kept them sharp and stocked. For big game like deer, bear, and elk, they grabbed bows and arrows, stalking through dense forests with quiet steps. A good shot could feed a family for days, the hides tanned for clothes or blankets. Smaller critters, raccoons, rabbits, squirrels, and turkeys didn't stand a chance against their blowguns. These weren't toys, long cane stems hollowed out, firing darts made of wood and feathers. Imagine a hunter crouched in the brush, lips to the tube, puffing a dart that drops a squirrel from a branch. Fishing rounded it out, they'd wade into streams with hooks and lines, stab fish with spears or set traps that snagged dinner while they worked elsewhere. And when the crops and hunts weren't enough, they'd roam the woods gathering wild roots, greens, berries, and nuts, every kid knowing which plants filled your belly and which didn't. Clothing was practical but had flair. Most of it came from woven cloth or deerskin, soft and tough from hours of tanning. Women wore dresses that flowed to their knees or ankles, simple but stitched with care. Men pulled on pants, fitted for moving through thickets or fields. Everyone wore shoes, maybe moccasins, to keep their feet safe on rocky trails. When winter hit, they'd throw on cloaks, thick woven cloth or fur from a bear. They'd taken down, wrapped tight against the cold. Hairstyles, that depended on the clan. Some men shaved clean, faces smooth as river stones. Others grew beards, full and wild. A few shaved their heads bare, while others rocked a topknot or ponytail, hair tied back with a strip of leather. It wasn't just style, it was a badge of who you were, which family you belonged to. Their villages were alive, buzzing with people. By the time Europeans showed up in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Cherokee had about 200 towns and villages, big ones, not just scattered huts. A typical town had 30 to 60 houses, built wattle and daub style. Picture it, a circular frame of poles woven with branches, like an upside-down basket plastered with mud to keep out the wind and rain. These homes were half sunken into the ground, cool in summer, warm in winter. In the center sat the council house, bigger, where everyone gathered. A sacred fire burned there, never let to die out, a heartbeat for the community. Later on, they switched things up, building log cabins with bark roofs, no windows, just one door, and a smoke hole up top. You duck inside and smell wood smoke, see shadows flicker from the fire pit. It was simple, sturdy, home. Religion tied it all together. The busk, or green corn festival, hit every year when the first corn ripened. It wasn't just a party, it was a reset. They'd clean out old fires, light new ones, share the fresh harvest, and give thanks. Imagine the smell of roasting corn, the crackle of flames, voices singing old songs. It was about starting fresh, keeping the cycle going. Their social setup was just as deep. They were matrilineal, split into 7 clans, and women ran the show at home. A woman owned the house, the land around it, and worked the fields. Kids belonged to her clan, not the father's. It was her call. What got planted? Who got fed first? The Cherokee saw women as life givers, not just for bearing kids, but for growing the food that kept everyone alive. That made them leaders, not in some loud, flashy way, but in the steady everyday grind of holding a community together. Government matched the rhythm of their lives. Every town had 2 chiefs. The white chief handled peace, sorting out disputes over land or trade, keeping things calm. The red chief took over in war, planning raids or defenses when trouble brewed. It was a split system, ready for whatever came. Women weren't sidelined either. They sat in on war councils, voices heard, advising the chiefs on strategy or what to do with prisoners. Picture a circle of leaders, smoke curling up, and a woman speaking up saying, "Spare him, he's got skills we need," or "He's too dangerous, let him go far from here." They didn't just watch, they shaped the outcome. That's the Cherokee way, practical, balanced, built to last. Slavery was part of Cherokee life, long before Europeans showed up. But it wasn't what you might picture. Back then, they'd grab captives from fights with other tribes, enemies who'd lost the battle. These weren't lifelong chains, though. The Cherokee oral tradition paints it as temporary. Hold them for a while, then let them go, or bring them into the fold. Imagine a warrior dragging a rival back to camp after a raid, tying him up near the fire. Over time, that guy might prove himself, earn a spot in the clan, maybe even a family. or he'd get cut loose, sent packing, with a warning it was less about owning people forever and more about settling scores or boosting numbers, a practical move in a world of constant push and pull with neighbors. Then the colonial era hit late 17th to early 18th century, around the 1670s to 1720s, and things shifted fast. Carolinian settlers rolled in, hungry for labor, and started buying slaves from the Cherokee. These weren't just random captives anymore. The Cherokee saw a market. They'd round up natives from other tribes during their wars, hand them over to traders, and watch them get shipped off to Virginia or further north. Picture a Cherokee negotiator standing by a riverbank swapping a bound prisoner for a stack of metal tools or a musket. It was trade, cold and simple, and it plugged them into a bigger game. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were playing the European system, turning war into profit. After more contact, the Cherokee started picking up European habits, and that included slavery as the colonists knew it. By the 18th century, some Cherokees weren't just trading captives. They were buying enslaved African Americans. These weren't warriors they'd beaten. They were people purchased to work fields or plantations. Think of a Cherokee farmer, maybe one who'd gotten rich off deerskin trades, walking through rows of corn, with a couple of enslaved hands tending the crop. It was a shift from their old ways, a sign they were adapting to the world, crashing in around them. They'd seen how the settlers built wealth, and some figured, we can do that too. It wasn't every Cherokee, but enough to mark a change, land and labor, turning into power. When the Trail of Tears came in 1838, this new slavery went with them. Forced out of their homes in the southeast, about 16,000 Cherokee marched west to Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, and they didn't go alone. They brought their enslaved African Americans along, hauling them on flatboats or trudging beside them on that brutal trek. Over 4,000 Cherokee died on the way. And who knows how many of the enslaved didn't make it? Records don't linger on that. Once they got there, the slave trade didn't stop. In Indian Territory, they kept buying and selling, working the land with forced labor, just like they'd started to back east. Imagine a Cherokee settler in this new place, battered from the journey, still clinging to that system, building a cabin and pointing enslaved workers to clear a field. It was survival, yes, but tangled up in a practice they'd borrowed from the people who'd pushed them out. Slavery wasn't just a footnote. For the Cherokee, it was a thread that ran through their story, shifting with every step they took. The Cherokee didn't see Europeans coming until 1540, when Hernando de Soto and his crew rolled up on the Tennessee River. Picture a line of Spanish soldiers, armor clanking, meeting Cherokee scouts along the water's edge. De Soto wasn't there to chat. He barely stuck around, too busy picking fights with other tribes nearby. His men moved on fast, leaving little mark. Then, between 1566 and 1690, another Spaniard, Juan Pardo, swung through. This time they lingered, building a fort and setting up a small mining and smelting gig. You can imagine the Cherokee watching from the hills, smoke rising from the Spanish camp, wondering what these strangers were digging for. But their mountain home kept them tucked away, a natural shield that held off bigger waves of outsiders until Virginia got settled in 1609. Those peaks and valleys bought them time. The English broke through that bubble in 1629. Traders pushed west into Cherokee lands, noses sniffing for profit. By 1673, settlers showed up at Echota, the Cherokee capital, ready to deal. Back then, the Cherokee numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000, a rough guess since no one was counting heads. Echota would have been buzzing. Traders unloading goods, Cherokee sizing them up. The Europeans brought brass kettles that gleamed in the sun, bolts of textiles, scissors and knives that cut cleaner than flint, guns that cracked louder than thunder, hatchets and hoes for the fields, plus shiny trinkets that caught the eye. In return, the Cherokee piled up deerskins, soft and scraped clean, beeswax from their hives, river cane baskets woven tight, and, native slaves from their raids. Picture a trader hefting a stack of hides, a Cherokee warrior nodding as he takes a musket, both knowing the game's changing. That trade flipped Cherokee life upside down. Before, medicine men held sway, guiding with wisdom and rituals. Now warriors took the lead, their skills in a fight turning into bargaining chips. Those same guys who'd hunted for food started chasing deer for profit, skins stacking up for the next English boat. It wasn't just stuff swapping hands, it was power shifting. And with the outsiders came trouble. In 1673, the Cherokee raided Spanish settlements in Florida, a bold jab at a rival power. They scrapped with coastal tribes. In the Carolinas, too, old grudges flaring up. By 1680, they'd gotten their hands on firearms, and villages turned into forts, walls rising around wattle and daub homes. You can see a warrior loading a musket, smoke curling from the barrel, ready for whatever's next. The fights didn't stop there. To the east, they clashed with the Catawba, a feud that ran hot and cold. Southward, the Creek and Choctaw pushed back, tensions simmering over land and trade. West lay the Chickasaw, another British buddy, and old rivalries kept the hatchet sharp. Up north, the Beaver Wars raged, a mess of French, Dutch, and English, scrapping over fur with native allies, caught in the middle. The Cherokee weren't sitting still, they were in the thick of it. By 1730, they made a big move, pledging loyalty to King George. They'd trade only with the English, a handshake to box out the French, circling nearby. Imagine a chief, at the meeting, feathers in his hair, agreeing to the deal while eyeing the guns it'd bring. But Europe didn't just bring trade and war. It brought death. Smallpox hit hard in the 18th century, tearing through in waves from the 1720s to 1750s. One outbreak after another, and the Cherokee population got sliced in half. From 20,000 to 50,000, they dropped to maybe 10,000 or 25,000. Picture a village, houses quiet, half the faces gone, kids coughing themselves out. No one had immunity. The disease didn't care about clans or chiefs. It came with the traders, the settlers, the guns, a shadow they couldn't fight off. The Cherokee stood tough, but that first brush with Europe left scars deeper than any battle. After the American Revolution wrapped up, in 1783, the new United States had its eyes on the Cherokee. Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, and George Washington, the big man himself, had a plan: assimilation. They figured the best way to keep peace was to turn the Cherokee into farmers, dress them in European clothes, teach them English, and swap their old beliefs for Christianity. Picture Knox in a stuffy office, scribbling out policies, while Washington nods, saying, "Make them like us, and the fighting stops." Missionaries rolled in to make it happen, setting up schools where Cherokee kids learned to read, write, and count. They taught the women how to keep a house the European way, think table manners, and sewing, while telling them to ditch the dances and rituals their grandparents knew. It was a full-on push to erase the old ways. The Cherokee didn't just roll over, though. They picked what worked for them and tossed the rest. Literacy? Sure, that's useful. Total cultural wipeout? No thanks. Enter Sequoyah, the guy who'd already shaken things up with his syllabary. Starting in 1809, he spent 12 years perfecting it, finishing in 1821. Those 86 symbols let the Cherokee read and write their own language fast. Imagine a kid scratching out her first words in Cherokee, or a chief sending a letter to another tribe. No translator needed. It wasn't just about books. It tied them together, kept their voice alive when the U.S. wanted it quiet. They took what the missionaries offered and bent it to fit their own mold. But land was slipping away. Between 1721 and 1777, 10 treaties with Britain had already shrunk their territory, carving off chunks of what's now North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia. By 1817, about a third of them, roughly 6,000 to 7,000, said enough and moved west to Arkansas under a U.S. treaty. They were tired of the squeeze. Then in 1828, Sequoyah was back at it, signing another treaty that swapped Arkansas land for a spot in what's now Oklahoma. These folks, called the Old Settlers, were the first wave west, trying to outrun the pressure. Back east, the ones who stayed doubled down on proving they could fit in. In the 1820s, they set up New Echota as their capital, wrote a constitution modeled after the U.S., and launched the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828, the first Native American newspaper. Picture a press clanking away, printing Cherokee and English side by side, shouting to the world, "We're here, we're modern." But the U.S. didn't care. They still wanted them gone. That push hit a breaking point with the Indian Removal Act in May 1830. President Andrew Jackson got Congress to sign off on kicking all eastern tribes west of the Mississippi. The Chickasaw, Choctaw Creek, and Seminole caved by 1832, signing treaties to leave. The Cherokee, they fought back. In 1831, Chief John Ross teamed up with lawyers for the Cherokee Nation, Georgia case, taking it to the Supreme Court. Ross stood tall, arguing their rights, but the court dodged, saying they weren't a foreign nation. Meanwhile, Georgia didn't wait. In 1834, they auctioned off Cherokee land in a lottery, settlers grabbing it up while Ross fumed. A splinter group, the Treaty Party, broke ranks in December 1835, signing the Treaty of New Echota. They sold out for $5 million, some supplies, and land west, even though most Cherokee hated it. The Senate ratified it on May 23, 1836, setting a deadline. May 1838, get out. June 1838 rolled around, and the forced march started at Ross's Landing, Georgia. About 16,000 Cherokee were herded onto flatboats on the Tennessee River. Packed so tight the boats nearly sank. Others rode trains or walked, feet blistering on a trail that stretched over 1,000 miles. More than 4,000 died. 25% gone, starved, sick, or frozen. Some slipped away, hiding in the mountains, but most ended up in Oklahoma. The aftermath was chaos. In 1839, the National Party, loyal to Ross, clashed with the old settlers over who'd run things. Revenge hit hard on June 22nd. Treaty Party leaders Major Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and John Ridge were killed. Major Ridge got ambushed on an Arkansas road. Boudinot tricked with a fake medicine plea. John Ridge stabbed in his bed. By July 1839, they signed an act of union, and in September, a new constitution named Ross Chief. The 1840s brought a civil war inside the nation, bloody and bitter, until August 6, 1846, when a treaty promised shared land and amnesty. They'd lost everything to get there, but they still held on. The Trail of Tears started with a law that hit like a hammer. In May 1830, President Andrew Jackson pushed the Indian Removal Act through Congress, a plan to shove all eastern tribes west of the Mississippi. He wanted the land clear for settlers, and he didn't care what it took. By 1832, the Chickasaw, Choctaw Creek, and Seminole had buckled, signing treaties to pack up and go. The Cherokee, though, weren't having it. They dug in their heels. In 1831, Chief John Ross rounded up some sharp American lawyers and took their fight to the Supreme Court with the Cherokee Nation. Georgia case. Ross stood there, a steady voice for his people, arguing they had rights to their land. The court sidestepped, calling them a domestic-dependent nation, not a full player in the game. It was a gut punch, but Georgia didn't even wait for the ruling. By 1834, they were auctioning off Cherokee land in a lottery, settlers snatching it up while Ross's pleas echoed in empty halls. A crack showed up in the Cherokee ranks. In December 1835, a small group called the Treaty Party, tired of the fight, signed the Treaty of New Echota. They didn't speak for most, but they sold out anyway. $5 million, some supplies, and a chunk of Western territory. Picture them hunched over the paper, ink drying, knowing half their people would curse their names. The U.S. Senate jumped on it, ratifying the deal on May 23, 1836, and setting a deadline. May 1838, you're gone. Most Cherokee spat on it, but the clock was ticking. When June 1838 hit, the hammer fell. About 16,000 Cherokee got rounded up at Ross's Landing in Georgia. Soldiers barked orders as families were shoved onto flatboats on the Tennessee River, so crammed, the water lapped at the edges. Others got herded onto trains or forced to walk 1,000 miles of dirt and despair. Picture a mother clutching a kid, feet raw, watching an elder collapse in the mud. More than 4,000 died, over 25%, starved, sick, or just too worn out to keep going. Some slipped away, vanishing into the mountains to dodge the march, but most trudged on to Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears wasn't a move, it was a death march, bodies marking the path. The mess didn't end when they got there. In 1839, the National Party, loyal to Ross, squared off with the old settlers, who'd come west earlier. They couldn't agree on who'd run the show, and bad blood. On June 22nd, revenge struck. Treaty Party leaders paid the price. Major Ridge got ambushed on an Arkansas road, cut down mid-journey. Elias Boudinot, fell to a trick attacked by men pretending they needed medicine. John Ridge didn't even get a chance, dragged from his bed and stabbed dead. Picture the killers melting back into the night, the air thick with payback. By July 1839, the factions met and signed an act of union, trying to patch things up. In September, they rolled out a new constitution, putting Ross in charge as chief, a nod to the East's old ways. But peace didn't stick. The 1840s turned into a civil war inside the nation, fights breaking out over power and blame. It dragged on, bloody and messy, until August 6, 1846, when a treaty finally landed. Brokered by the U.S., it promised shared land and amnesty, a shaky truce to stop the bleeding. They'd clawed through hell to get there, and somehow they were still standing. When the Civil War kicked off in 1861, the Cherokee found themselves picking sides, and it wasn't a clean choice. They argued hard among themselves. Some saw the Union as a better bet. Others leaned toward the Confederacy, figuring it might shield their land from more U.S. grabs. In the end, they threw in with the South. After a messy debate, out in North Carolina, about 1,100 Cherokee and white locals formed Thomas's Legion, named after William Holland Thomas, a white guy. They'd adopted as their own. These fighters headed to Virginia, slugging it out in the thick of it, earning a rep for holding their ground. Picture them trekking through muddy fields, rifles slung, a mix of Cherokee warriors and mountain men staring down Union lines. They stuck it out till the bitter end. Thomas's Legion was the last Confederate unit to surrender in North Carolina, laying down arms on May 9, 1865, in Waynesville. The war was over, but their fight wasn't. After the dust settled in 1865, things shifted fast. In 1866, a treaty with the U.S. forced the Cherokee to free the African Americans they'd enslaved. Imagine a Cherokee farmer in Indian Territory signing papers under a soldier's watch, letting go of workers he'd brought west on the Trail of Tears. It was a hard pivot, undoing a system they'd built up. Meanwhile, back east, William Holland Thomas was busy. Between 1838 and 1865, he'd been buying up land for the Eastern Band, the ones who dodged removal, or snuck back after. This chunk, called the Qualla Boundary, started with about 1,000 Cherokee, folks who'd hidden in the mountains or walked home. After that brutal march, picture Thomas, haggling with sellers, pocketing deeds, while those holdouts built cabins in the hills, clinging to what was theirs. But the land kept shrinking. In 1887, the General Allotment Act hit, a U.S. move to break up tribal holdings. They sliced Cherokee land into plots, handed some to individuals, and called the rest surplus. That extra got sold off cheap to outsiders. Imagine a government man with a map, carving lines through forests and fields, families watching their world shrink again. Then, in 1891, the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma, a big stretch they'd held onto, got sold to the U.S. On September 16, 1893, they opened it up to settlers. About 100,000 people raced in, staking claims in a single day. Picture the chaos, wagons rolling, dust kicking up, Cherokee land swallowed by a flood of newcomers, from war to treaties to land grabs. The Cherokee kept getting pushed, but that core, that stubborn will to stay, never broke. By the time Oklahoma became a state, on November 16, 1907, the Cherokee were folded into the U.S. as citizens. It wasn't a choice. They lost the right to elect their own chiefs, a gut punch to their independence. From then on, presidents picked who'd lead, a string of appointed figureheads that lasted decades. Imagine a Cherokee elder watching some outsider call the shots, the old ways of choosing their own fading fast. That setup held until 1970, when a congressional act signed by Nixon finally handed back the reins. Picture the first election after that, voices rising in polling stations, a spark of control reignited after 63 years. The world wars pulled the Cherokee into a different fight. In 1918, during World War I, Cherokee soldiers in the 119th and 120th U.S. Infantry Regiments stepped up in a big way. On August 21st, during the Somme offensive in France, they used their language to stump the Germans. Picture them hunched over field phones, barking orders in Cherokee, words the enemy couldn't crack. It was the first known time the U.S. military leaned on native languages. Like that, a trick that worked so well, it stuck. Fast forward to World War II, from 1941 to 1945, and about 25,000 Native Americans, Cherokees included, signed up. They fought across Europe and the Pacific, some as code talkers again, whispering messages that kept the Axis guessing. Imagine a Cherokee kid, fresh from Oklahoma, dodging bullets while his words saved lives halfway around the world. The 1960s brought a new battle, the Civil Rights Movement. The Cherokee didn't sit it out. They pushed for Native rights, shoulder to shoulder with African Americans, demanding a say in their future. That fight paid off. In 1970, when they won back self-governance, a victory carved out of protests and grit. Picture a rally, Cherokee flags waving, voices loud, reclaiming what was theirs. It wasn't just about power. It was about identity, proving they could stand tall in a country that had spent centuries pushing them down. Today, the Cherokee are split into 3 federally recognized tribes: the United Keetoowah Band in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and the Eastern Band in North Carolina. Each one's a thread of the same story, stretched across time. The 2000 census clocked 281,000 people saying they're Cherokee, with another 448,000 claiming part Cherokee roots, a million-strong echo of a people who wouldn't fade. The language still lives too, spoken by 12,000 to 22,000, passed down in classrooms and kitchens. Imagine a kid in Tahlequah scribbling Sequoiah's symbols, or an elder in the Qualla boundary, telling stories by a fire. They're still here, not just surviving, but thriving, a testament to a spirit that no war, no march, no law could break.